Chapter 1. The Mistake That Changed Everything. The dim glow of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Lena Carter sat in the sterile clinic room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had never imagined she would end up here, agreeing to something as surreal as becoming a surrogate. But life had a cruel way of forcing desperate choices on people, and right now she had no other option. The contract sat on the table in front of her, thick with legal jargon, but the only words that mattered to her were the six-figure sum at the bottom of the page. Enough to pay off her mother's medical bills, enough to secure a future for herself. "This is your last chance to back out, Dr. Hayes," the fertility specialist said, looking at her over his glasses. Lena took a deep breath. "I'm sure." She had done her research. The intended parents were a wealthy couple struggling with infertility, unable to conceive naturally. Their profile described them as loving, desperate for a child, and willing to give their baby the best life possible. She convinced herself that she was doing something good. With trembling fingers, she signed the papers. The mistake was set in motion. Lena stared at the ultrasound screen, her heart pounding. The technician's eyes widened slightly before she turned to her with a cautious smile. "Congratulations, Miss Carter," she said. "You're having twins." Lena's stomach twisted. Twins? That wasn't possible. The couple she was caring for had only fertilized one embryo. Confusion clouded her mind. She was about to ask the technician if she was sure when she noticed the strange look on the woman's face, a look of hesitation. "Is something wrong?" Lena's voice wavered. The technician cleared her throat, smiling too brightly. "Everything looks healthy, but there was something off in the way she avoided Lena's gaze." A chill ran down her spine. Something was wrong. Lena sat in Dr. Hayes' office, shaking as he explained what had happened. "There was a mix-up at the clinic," he said carefully. "The embryos were mislabeled. You are not carrying the intended parent's child." Lena's mind spun. "Then whose babies am I carrying?" A long silence. Then Dr. Hayes said a name that sent her world crashing down. Damian Cross. She felt like she had been punched. Damian Cross, the billionaire CEO of Cross Enterprises, one of the most powerful and feared men in the country. A man who had been in a devastating accident years ago, leaving him in a wheelchair. A man the world believed was infertile. She gripped the edge of the chair. "This has to be a mistake." Dr. Hayes looked grim. "I'm afraid it's not." Her body trembled. The intent from her. There was only one choice. She had to disappear. 3 years later, Lena held her son's tiny hand as she stepped off the plane, her stomach in knots. 3 years. She had kept them hidden for 3 years. Now, she was back, because her little girl was dying. Tears stung her eyes as she clutched the medical records in her bag. Her daughter, Emma, needed a genetic match for a rare condition. No one else was compatible. No one except her father. She had no choice. She had to find Damian Cross and pray he didn't take her children away. Chapter 2. The Return to His World. Lena's grip tightened on Noah's small hand as they stepped into the private hospital lobby. The pristine white walls and the scent of antiseptic made her heart pound harder. Every step back into this city felt like a step closer to her worst nightmare. She had worked so hard to disappear. 3 years of hiding, looking over her shoulder, making sure no one from Damian Cross' world could find her. And now, she was walking straight into the lion's den, for Emma. She swallowed hard, clutching the medical files in her bag. Her daughter's condition was worsening. She didn't have time to be afraid. High above the city, inside Cross Enterprises' tower, Damian sat in his office, his hands gripping the wheels of his sleek custom wheelchair. His sharp, ice-blue eyes were locked on the financial reports in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. A familiar ache burned in his chest, the reminder of everything he had lost: his legs, his ability to walk, his future, and apparently his chance to ever have children. He had accepted it long ago, until a doctor's urgent call changed everything. "Mr. Cross, there's a woman here at the hospital with a child in need of a genetic match, a child that might be yours." The words slammed into him like a bullet. Impossible. The doctor explained the situation, but it barely registered in Damian's mind. A woman, a child, his blood, and suddenly the past, the pain, the betrayal, the emptiness he had buried so deeply came rushing back. He had to see her. Now. Lena's stomach dropped when the heavy hospital doors swung open. He was here. Damian Cross rolled into the room, his presence overpowering despite the wheelchair. He was still the same man, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, eyes as cold as steel. Except now, those icy blue eyes were locked on her, and they were filled with fury. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that sent shivers down her spine, he said, "You have exactly 5 seconds to tell me why the hell you disappeared with my children." Lena's pulse pounded. This was it. She had come here begging for his help, but Damien Cross was not a man who forgave, and she had stolen everything from him. Chapter 3, A Deal with the Devil. Lena's breath caught in her throat as Damien's piercing blue eyes bore into her, his expression unreadable, but the fury in them was unmistakable. The room felt too small, the air too thick with tension and unspoken truths. Noah gripped her hand tightly, his little fingers curling against hers. He was too young to understand what was happening, but he could sense the storm in the air. Damien's voice was low and dangerous when he spoke again. "Where is my daughter?" Lena's nails dug into her palm as she forced herself to breathe. This was about Emma, nothing else. "She's in the ICU, Lena said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's sick. She needs a transplant, and you're the only possible match." Something flickered in Damien's eyes, a crack in his anger, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He rolled closer, his presence suffocating. "And if she weren't sick, would I have ever known about them?" Lena's stomach twisted. She knew the truth would only make him angrier. She had run, she had hidden, and now she was back only because she needed something from him. She licked her dry lips. No excuses," Damien cut her off sharply. "You stole my children from me. Do you have any idea what that means?" His voice dropped lower, a deadly whisper. "What that cost me?" Lena did know. She had seen his name in the news over the years, the ruthless, cold CEO who had buried himself in power and wealth after his accident. She had watched from afar, knowing she had taken the only thing that could have changed him, their children. But she had been terrified. Terrified that if he knew, he would take them away from her. And now she was handing them right back to him. Lena lifted her chin, fighting the tremble in her voice. "Damien, please, this isn't about us, it's about Emma." Something dark crossed his face. "No, this is about more than Emma." His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "You don't get to run for 3 years and then come back when you need something from me." Lena's heart pounded. He wasn't going to help. No, no, no. She felt the desperation creeping in. If he refused Emma, her baby girl, Lena dropped to her knees in front of him. Tears burned in her eyes as she looked up at him, raw and vulnerable. "I know you hate me. I know what I did was wrong. But please, Emma is your daughter. If you don't help her, she will die." A muscle clenched in Damien's jaw. His gaze flickered down to Noah, who clung to Lena's side, wide-eyed and silent. For a long moment, the room was quiet. Then something shifted. Damien's gaze settled on Noah for the first time, truly seeing him. The boy was his mirror, the same deep blue eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, even the way his small brows furrowed in confusion echoed Damien's own expressions. Damien's fingers curled against his wheelchair armrests. His throat felt tight, unfamiliar emotions clawing their way up. This boy, his son, was real. Noah's tiny hands tightened on Lena's dress as he stared up at the man before him, unsure. Then, in the smallest, softest voice, he whispered, "Are you my daddy?" Damien inhaled sharply. Lena's heart stopped. She hadn't prepared for this, hadn't prepared for Damien to look at Noah like that, like he had just been punched in the gut. For a long, excruciating moment, Damien didn't say anything. Then finally his voice came, hoarse, raw, disbelieving. "Yes." Noah's lips parted slightly. He studied Damien with quiet curiosity, his little face filled with wonder. And then the little boy took a hesitant step forward, and another, until he stood right in front of Damien. The room was silent, the air so thick with tension Lena could barely breathe. Then Noah did something that made her throat close with emotion. He lifted his small hand and touched Damien's cheek, a soft, hesitant touch, like he was making sure Damien was real. Damien's entire body stilled. Lena saw it, the way his jaw clenched, the way his breathing became uneven. He was breaking. Damien Cross, the ruthless billionaire, the man who showed no emotion, who had closed himself off from the world, was breaking. His fingers twitched against his armrest as if fighting the urge to reach out. But Noah didn't move away. And in that moment, Lena knew everything had changed, because Damien Cross had just met his son. and there was no way in hell he was going to let either of them go now. Damien finally tore his gaze from Noah, his jaw tightening as he turned back to Lena. His voice was steel when he spoke. "I will help Emma," he said. Lena exhaled in relief, but the cold smirk that touched his lips made her freeze. "But under my terms." Her stomach twisted. "What? What do you mean?" Damien's eyes darkened. "You took 3 years from me, Lena. You took my children, my chance at being a father. That ends now." Her breath caught. "You and the twins will move in with me. You will stay under my roof, and I will be involved in their lives, completely." His tone was sharp, leaving no room for argument. "And once Emma is better, you won't run again, because you belong to me now." Lena's hands shook. She knew what this was. A deal with the devil. One she had no choice but to accept. "Fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Damien's smirk deepened. "Good. Then let's begin." Chapter 4. Moving into his world. Lena sat stiffly in the back seat of the sleek black SUV as it navigated the winding roads leading to Damien Cross Estate. Her hands trembled in her lap, her stomach twisting with nerves. She could feel Damien's presence beside her, his sharp gaze flickering between her and Noah, who sat between them, staring out the window with wide, curious eyes. It had happened so fast. One moment, she had been begging for Damien's help, and the next, she was trapped in a deal she couldn't escape. She had promised herself she would never let this man control her life, and now, here she was, moving into his home. Noah, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her, turned toward Damien. "Do you have a big house?" Damien's cold exterior softened, if only slightly. "You'll see soon enough." Lena's throat tightened as she stole a glance at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something dark, something possessive in the way he looked at Noah. He wasn't just helping Emma. He was claiming his children, and her, by default. The reality of it settled heavily on her chest. She was trapped. Arrival at Cross Estate. The car pulled up in front of a massive, modern mansion surrounded by tall iron gates. The estate was everything she expected, cold, grand, and intimidating. Lena swallowed hard as the driver opened the door for them. Damien's voice was firm. "Noah, stay close to your mother." Noah nodded and clutched Lena's hand, his little fingers curling around hers. They stepped into the grand marble foyer, and Lena couldn't help but feel out of place in the luxurious surroundings. A tall, elegant woman, clearly the housekeeper, approached them with a polite smile. "Mr. Cross, we've prepared the guest rooms as you requested," she said before glancing at Lena and Noah. "Guest rooms?" Damien's response was instant. "They won't be guests. They live here now." Lena's breath hitched, but before she could protest, he turned to her. "You and Noah will stay in the East Wing. Emma's nursery will be set up there as well once she's home." Her stomach dropped. Once she's home, he was already planning for a future she hadn't agreed to. Lena's pulse pounded. "Damien, this is only temporary." His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. "That's where you're wrong, Lena. You don't get to decide that anymore." A shiver ran through her. Noah, blissfully unaware of the tension, took a hesitant step toward Damien. "Will I have my own room?" the boy asked. Damien studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yes." Then, after a pause, "You'll have anything you want." Lena's breath caught. Damien wasn't just making room for Noah. He was making room for himself in Noah's life. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just about Emma's survival. Damien was determined to erase the last 3 years, to take back what he believed was his. And there was nothing she could do to stop him. Later that evening, after settling Noah into his room, Lena found Damien waiting for her in the hallway, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The dim light made the angles of his face sharper, his gaze even more dangerous. "There's something you need to understand, Lena." Her fingers curled into fists. "I already know I'm trapped." Damien smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not just trapped, owned." Her breath hitched. "You don't own me." Chapter 5. Meeting his daughter. The hospital air was too cold, too sterile, but Damien barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to the sight before him. A small, fragile child lying in a hospital bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her, his daughter, Emma. For 3 years, he had lived under the belief that he would never have children, that his accident had stolen that from him, that there would never be a piece of him living beyond his own damaged body. But here she was, and she was fighting for her life. His hands clenched against the wheels of his chair as he took a slow, measured breath. The sharp beeping of machines filled the silence. The sight of her, so tiny, so vulnerable, hit him harder than anything had in years. A storm of emotions raged inside him. Rage at Lena for keeping her from him. Guilt for not knowing sooner. And something worse than both. Fear. Because for the first time since his accident, Damien felt powerless. Lena stood on the other side of the bed, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with silent warning. But she didn't stop him as he reached out. Damien's fingers shook as he brushed them lightly against Emma's tiny hand. Her skin was warm, soft, so small against his calloused fingers. Then, to his shock, her little fingers curled weakly around his. A sharp breath left him. His throat tightened painfully. She was holding him. His daughter was holding on to him. The weight of that moment nearly shattered him. "She's strong," Lena said softly, watching him. "But she needs help, Damien. She needs you." Something cracked in his chest. She needed him. For years, Damien had believed he was nothing more than a man who built empires, signed billion-dollar deals, and crushed his enemies. He was feared, respected, but he had never been needed. But this tiny girl, she needed him more than anyone ever had, and he would not fail her. He swallowed hard and looked up at Lena. "What did the doctors say?" His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Lena's lip trembled. "She needs a transplant, a match." She exhaled shakily. "You're the only one who can do it." His jaw tightened. "Then tell them to take whatever they need from me." Lena's eyes widened. "Damien, there is no discussion." He cut her off, his voice firm. "I will save my daughter." His words were a vow, an unshakable promise, because Emma was his. And no one, not fate, not illness, not even Lena's betrayal, was going to take her away from him. Damien forced himself to tear his gaze away from Emma, his emotions raw. He turned his piercing eyes onto Lena, and for the first time she looked afraid, not of what he would do now, but what he would do after. His voice was quiet, deadly. "After Emma is safe, we settle this, completely." Lena's breath hitched. "Damien, you kept them from me." His voice was steel, but there was something dangerous beneath the surface, something darker than rage. "And now you think you can just walk away again?" She took a step back, but he didn't let her escape. "You gave birth to my children, Lena." His voice dropped lower, colder. "And now you will live with the consequences." She stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. There was no walking away from him. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 6. Bound by Blood. The hospital lights were too bright, the sterile air thick with tension. Lena sat beside Emma's bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of her tiny chest. The beeping machines were a constant reminder of how fragile her daughter was, how close she had come to losing her. Across the room, Damien stood silent, his powerful presence impossible to ignore. The doctors had already prepped him for the transplant. His blood had been drawn, and the tests had confirmed it. He was a perfect match. Because he was her father, her only chance. And now, everything was changing. A doctor walked in, clearing his throat. "Mr. Cross, we're ready for you." Lena's stomach clenched. She hadn't expected this from him. A part of her had believed he would use Emma's illness as leverage, force her into more impossible choices. But he hadn't hesitated, not once. Damien gave her a long, unreadable look before rolling his wheelchair toward the door. But before he disappeared, he spoke without turning back. "After this, there will be no more running, Lena?" Her fingers curled into fists as the door closed behind him. He was saving Emma. But at what cost? The transplant was a success. The doctor said Emma would recover, but it would take time. And as Lena sat by her daughter's side, relief flooded through her. But so did fear. Because she wasn't just indebted to Damien for saving Emma, she was trapped in his world now. And Damien Cross never let go of what was his. The moment Damien returned to Emma's room after his procedure, Lena knew. Something in him had changed. Before, he had been angry, resentful, a man who believed he had been robbed of something. But now he was a father who had almost lost his daughter, and that made him far more dangerous. He rolled up beside Emma's bed, staring at her as if memorizing every tiny feature. Lena's breath caught when he reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against Emma's cheek. Soft, gentle. Not the touch of the ruthless man she knew, but the touch of a father. Lena swallowed hard. "Damien," his piercing blue eyes lifted to hers. "She is mine." His voice was low, firm, unchanging. "No more secrets. No more running. You understand that, don't you?" A shiver ran down her spine. He wasn't asking, he was staking his claim on Emma, on Noah, and on her. When Emma was finally cleared for release, Damien made his intentions crystal clear. She and the twins would go straight to his estate. No more debate, no more Lena deciding what was best for his children. As she packed up Emma's things, she felt his eyes on her, watching, waiting, claiming. "Damien," she said, her voice strained, "we need to talk about this." He tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. "About what exactly?" "About boundaries, about the fact that I am still their mother." His smirk faded, replaced by something colder. "Mother?" His voice was almost mocking. "You were a mother who ran." Lena flinched. "I won't be a father who loses." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "So let me make this simple for you, Lena." He rolled closer, his powerful presence pinning her in place. "You belong to me now. You, the twins, everything." Her breath hitched. Trapped. There was no escaping Damien Cross. Chapter 7. Living Under His Rules. The drive back to Damien's estate was suffocatingly quiet. Lena sat stiffly in the back seat of the SUV, Emma sleeping in her arms, Noah nestled close beside her. Across from them, Damien sat motionless, his icy blue eyes fixed out the window, but she could feel his presence, his control wrapping around them like invisible chains. This was it. No more running, no more escape. They belonged to Damien Cross now. The moment they arrived, the household staff rushed forward, ready to assist. Damien's voice was sharp, commanding. "Take Emma to the East Wing. Her room needs to be temperature-controlled, and the nurses will monitor her recovery closely." His words made Lena's stomach twist. Nurses? A temperature-controlled room? He was already making decisions without her. She held Emma closer. "Damien, I can take care of her myself." He cut her off with a look. "Not up for debate." His tone was final. "You had 3 years of making choices for them without me, Lena. That ends now." Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't co-parenting. This was a takeover. She hated him for it. And yet, a part of her knew he wasn't entirely wrong. He had missed everything, their first steps, their first words, their entire existence. And now, he was making sure he would never miss another moment, at any cost. Later that night, after settling the twins in, Lena retreated to the guest room Damien had assigned her. The moment she closed the door behind her, her body sagged against it, exhaustion sinking in. But the relief was short-lived, because Damien was already there, waiting. Her breath caught. He leaned against the edge of the fireplace, sleeves rolled up, his strong forearms resting casually at his sides. His presence was intimidating, suffocating, and undeniably irresistible. Lena's pulse pounded. "What are you doing here?" His lips curled slightly. "We need to talk." She folded her arms. "I think we've done enough of that for one day." Damien didn't move, but something in his gaze shifted, a smoldering intensity that made her feel exposed. "You still think you can fight me, don't you?" His voice was low, dangerous. She swallowed hard. He pushed off the fireplace, rolling toward her, stopping only inches away. "You forget," he murmured, his voice like silk. "I am a man who always wins." Her heart slammed against her ribs. Too close. Too much. His scent, clean, masculine, intoxicating, wrapped around her, making it impossible to breathe. But she forced herself to stand tall, to meet his challenge. "I'm not a business deal, Damien," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not something you can own." His smirk deepened. "No?" he murmured. "Then why does it feel like you already belong to me?" Heat crawled up her spine. Because deep down she knew. He was right, and that was the most dangerous part of all. Damien studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're mine now, Lena. And whether you admit it or not, you feel it too." Her breath hitched. She did, and that terrified her more than anything, because fighting Damien Cross wasn't just a losing battle, it was a war she could never win. Chapter 8. A Battle of Wills. Lena woke to the soft sound of the waves crashing in the distance, the scent of the ocean carried in through the open balcony doors. For a moment she forgot where she was, but then reality came crashing back. Damien's estate, his rules, his control, and no way to escape. She sat up in bed, running a hand through her tangled hair. The events of the past 24 hours weighed heavily on her. Emma was safe. Damien had saved her, but at what cost? Her freedom? Her sanity? A knock at the door startled her. Before she could respond, the door swung open. And there he was, Damien Cross, dressed in a crisp, tailored shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers with the same intensity he always carried. A shiver ran down her spine. He didn't knock, he didn't wait. because Damien Cross didn't ask for permission. He simply took. Lena shot him a glare. "You don't just walk into my room," Damien smirked. "You forget. You're living under my roof now." She clenched her jaw, gripping the blanket tighter around her. "That doesn't mean you get to barge in whenever you feel like it." He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to the exposed skin of her neck before slowly traveling back up to her lips. A slow, knowing smile played on his mouth. "You should start getting used to it." Her pulse jumped. This man was insufferable. Lena hated how he got under her skin so easily. "I came to tell you breakfast is ready," Damien continued, watching her reaction closely. "Noah is already downstairs." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Noah. Right, this was about the twins, not about Damien's ridiculous ability to unnerve her. "Fine," she muttered, sliding out of bed. But before she could grab her robe, Damien was suddenly there, too close, his fingers grazing her wrist. Lena froze. Her breath hitched as his fingers lingered a moment too long, as if testing the boundaries between them. His voice dropped, soft but commanding. "You'll eat with me. Every morning. No more avoiding me." She swallowed hard. "Why? So you can remind me how trapped I am?" His smirk deepened. "No, Lena. So you can accept it." Her heart pounded. Damien Cross was dangerous, not because he had power over her, but because he knew exactly how to unravel her. The dining room was a picture of elegance, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, a long mahogany table set with fine china. Noah sat near the head of the table, happily stuffing his face with pancakes. Lena's chest tightened at the sight. He looked so at ease, as if he belonged here. Damien sat across from them, his expression unreadable as he sipped his black coffee. It was surreal, the three of them sitting here together, like a family. But this wasn't a family, this was a war. And Damien? He was winning. Halfway through breakfast, Noah turned to Damien, his little face thoughtful. "Are you really my dad?" he asked, tilting his head. Lena froze. Damien's fingers stilled on his coffee cup. For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he set his cup down. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Noah's. "Yes," he said simply. Noah blinked, considering that. Then, to Lena's absolute shock, he grinned. "Cool." Damien's brows lifted slightly. Amusement? Surprise? She wasn't sure. But something about the way Noah accepted him so easily made Lena's stomach tighten. Noah had no idea what Damien was capable of. No idea that his father was a man who never let go of what was his, and now that he had his children, he would never let them go again. A new threat looms. Just as Lena thought she might survive the rest of breakfast, a new voice interrupted. A woman's voice. "I see you're already playing house, Damien." Lena turned sharply. A tall, striking brunette stood at the entrance of the dining room, dressed in an expensive suit, her red lips curled in amusement. Damien's expression turned to ice. "Victoria." His voice was dangerously cold. Lena's stomach dropped. She knew that name, Victoria Hale, Damien's ex-fiancée. And from the way she was looking at Lena, this was about to get a lot worse. Chapter 9, Confrontation and Consequences. The moment Victoria Hale stepped into the dining room, the air shifted. Lena could feel it. The coldness in Damien's expression, the tension coiling between them like a silent war waiting to explode. Victoria was stunning, elegant in her tailored designer suit, her long dark hair sleek and perfect. Everything about her screamed wealth, power, and arrogance. And the way she was looking at Lena? Like she was nothing, a nobody, a mistake. Damien's hand tightened around his coffee cup, his entire posture stiff with irritation. "What the hell are you doing here, Victoria?" Victoria's painted red lips curled into a knowing smile. "Is that really how you greet your ex-fiancé?" Lena's stomach dropped. So, it was true. She was the woman Damien had almost married, and now she was standing in his home looking at Lena like an unwanted pest. Noah, oblivious to the tension, continued eating his pancakes. "Who's she?" he asked through a mouthful of syrup. Victoria's cold gaze flickered toward him, studying him. And in that moment, Lena saw it. The exact moment Victoria realized the truth, that Noah was Damien's son. Her lips parted slightly, but her eyes darkened with something dangerous. Lena had seen that look before. It was the look of a woman who hated losing. Damien exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "You need to leave." But Victoria's smirk only deepened. "Oh, Damien, ow," she purred, stepping farther into the room. "I think I deserve to stay. After all, I was supposed to be the mother of your children." Lena's hands curled into fists. This woman had no idea what she was talking about. But Damien, He hadn't denied it. Lena's stomach tightened. How close had they been? Had he actually loved Victoria once? Damien's voice was sharp. That was years ago. We're done. Victoria arched a perfectly shaped brow. Oh, but it seems you've replaced me quite quickly. Her gaze flickered to Lena, assessing, judging, and then her smile turned cruel. I have to admit, she said, tilting her head. I expected better. Lena saw red. She wasn't a violent person, but something primal burned in her chest, something that wanted to rip that smug smile right off Victoria's face. But before she could open her mouth, Damien moved. His chair rolled closer, his voice cold, sharp, and commanding. Careful, Victoria. For the first time, Victoria stiffened, because this was not a man she could manipulate anymore. Lena exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't let this woman see her break, wouldn't let her think she had any power here. But then Victoria's gaze dropped to Emma, who still lay peacefully in her baby carrier beside Lena, and her lips curled in mock sympathy. Oh dear, she murmured. Two of them? You must be exhausted, darling. She gave Lena a slow once-over, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, like she didn't belong here. That was it. Lena placed her fork down with deliberate precision and stood slowly. She could feel Damien's eyes on her, watching, waiting. Victoria smirked, as if she thought Lena was about to crumble, but instead Lena met her gaze, her voice even but sharp as a blade. I don't know what kind of power you think you have here, she said, holding Victoria's gaze unflinchingly. But let me make something clear. You are the past. Victoria's smirk faltered. Lena took a step closer. And as for me, I'm the one Damien chose, whether you like it or not. A bold-faced lie. But Lena didn't care, because the way Victoria's jaw clenched, her confidence cracking, that was worth it. Damien's lips twitched. Just slightly. Like he was amused. Like he enjoyed watching Lena fight. Victoria's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her gaze flickering to Damien. But he didn't defend her. Didn't say a damn word. That was all the confirmation Victoria needed. Her lips pursed, but her mask of cool confidence returned. She turned on her heel, heading toward the door. But before she left, she looked over her shoulder, her gaze locking onto Lena one last time. Her next words were a promise. This isn't over. Then she was gone. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Noah, completely unbothered, took another bite of pancakes. She was kinda scary. Damien exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. You have no idea. Lena finally let out a shaky breath. That was intense. She turned to Damien, her voice quiet but firm. She's not going to just walk away, is she? Damien's jaw tightened. No, he admitted, his gaze darkening. Victoria doesn't like losing. Lena's stomach twisted. Damien's ex-fiancé wasn't just going to leave quietly. She was going to make their lives hell, and Lena wasn't sure if she was ready for that war. Later that evening, after the twins were asleep, Lena found herself alone with Damien in his office. The tension between them was thick, electric. Damien leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her. You held your ground today, he murmured. Lena folded her arms. Did you expect me to run? A slow smirk. No, I expected you to fight. Her breath caught, because there was something dangerous in his gaze, something possessive. And when he rolled closer, invading her space, her heart pounded. You're mine now, Lena. His voice was low, deadly. That means you fight for me, for us, for our family. Her stomach flipped, because it sounded like a promise and a threat. She swallowed hard. And what if I don't want to be yours? His smirk deepened. His hand reached out, trailing his fingertips along her wrist, up her forearm. A slow, burning touch. Lena stopped breathing. Damien leaned in, his voice a dangerous whisper against her skin. Then he'll make you want to be. Her body betrayed her. A shiver ran down her spine. She should hate him. She should push him away, but instead, she couldn't move at all. And Damien knew it. Chapter 10, A Father's Awakening. It was strange. Damien's home was always so silent, so cold. But now there was a different energy running through the walls, a warmth that hadn't been there before. She slipped out of bed, wrapping a robe around herself, before stepping into the hallway. And that's when she heard it. Noah's laughter, followed by Damien's deep, amused voice. Her heart stopped. She hurried down the stairs and into the massive living room, where a sight she never expected greeted her. Damien sat in his wheelchair, his sleeves rolled up, his usually composed exterior slightly ruffled. But the biggest shock? Noah was sitting on his lap, gripping the wheels of his chair, his little face full of concentration. Damien was teaching him how to steer. You have to balance your weight, Damien instructed, gripping the wheels with his large hands while Noah watched carefully. Not too fast or you'll tip forward. Noah nodded, biting his lip in focus. Like this? He pushed the wheels and Damien let out a rare chuckle as the chair moved forward. Exactly, Damien murmured, watching Noah like he was the most fascinating thing in the world. Lena's breath hitched, because she had never seen Damien like this. Not ruthless, not cold, just a man realizing he was a father. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be one. Damien must have sensed her presence because he turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. But for once, there was no hardness in his gaze, just something, softer, something she wasn't sure she knew how to handle. I told him he could try, Damien said smoothly, nodding toward Noah. He wanted to see how my chair worked. Lena swallowed hard. And you let him? Noah beamed, completely unaware of the tension between them. Mom, it's so cool. He can move super fast. Damien smirked slightly, watching Noah with amusement. He's a natural. Lena felt her heart twist. Because this was what she had been afraid of. That once Damien got close, he would pull them in, that he would claim them, and that Noah, so innocent and loving, would fall for his father completely. Noah turned back to Damien, curiosity shining in his blue eyes just like his father's. Do you ever miss walking? Lena stiffened. She was about to scold Noah for asking something so personal, but Damien didn't look angry. If anything, he looked thoughtful. Sometimes, Damien admitted, his voice unusually gentle. Noah was silent for a moment, his little face scrunched in deep thought. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his small hand over Damien's. But you don't need to walk, he said, his voice full of innocent certainty. You're already the strongest person I know. Lena stopped breathing. Because Damien, cold, untouchable Damien, looked like he had just been punched in the chest. His grip tightened on the wheels, his throat working as if he was struggling for words. He had built entire empires, had destroyed men with a single order, and yet this tiny boy had just completely unraveled him. Damien exhaled, his jaw tightening, but when he spoke, his voice was hoarse. Thank you, Noah. Later that afternoon, Lena found them again, this time in Damien's private study. She had expected coldness, distance, but instead, there was Damien kneeling beside Noah, helping him button the cuffs of a tiny, custom-tailored suit. Lena leaned against the doorway, stunned. You're making him wear a suit? She asked, raising a brow. Damien glanced at her, completely unfazed. He should learn how to dress properly. Noah looked up at her, grinning. I look like Dad. Her stomach flipped. Dad. It had come out so naturally, like he had been calling him that his whole life. Damien's lips twitched, but he didn't correct him. Lena couldn't breathe. Damien stood, adjusting Noah's tie. A man should always be presentable, Noah nodded seriously. So if I look important, it'll be important? Damien's gaze softened just slightly. Something like that, Noah beamed. Then I want to be just like you. Lena's heart clenched. Because for all the ways she hated Damien, for all the ways she wanted to resist him, Noah already adored him, and maybe, just maybe, Damien wasn't as cold as he wanted the world to believe. That night, Lena found Damien in Emma's nursery. He sat beside her crib, his large hand resting lightly over Emma's tiny one, a silent protector. Lena swallowed hard, stepping inside. She's doing better, she said softly. Damien didn't look at her. I should have been here sooner. Lena's heart twisted. Damien. I missed everything. His voice was quiet, raw. Her first word, her first steps, her first laugh. His jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. I wasn't there. Lena felt her defenses cracking. Because for the first time, Damien wasn't trying to control or intimidate her. He was just a father who had lost time. Slowly, Lena stepped closer. She still has a lifetime of firsts ahead of her, she said softly. You don't have to miss those. Damien turned to her, his blue eyes dark and unreadable, and suddenly, the space between them felt too small. Lena's breath caught. Damien's gaze dropped to her lips just for a second. A shiver ran down her spine. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, he looked away. She's my daughter, he murmured, and I will never let her go. His words sent a chill down her spine because he wasn't just talking about Emma, he was talking about Noah, and about her. Lena knew in that moment there was no escaping Damien Cross. Not now, not ever. Chapter 11, A Father's Instinct. Damien had always believed power meant control, the ability to shape outcomes, bend the world to his will. But for the first time, power felt like something entirely different. It felt like the sound of Noah's laughter echoing through the halls. It felt like Emma's tiny fingers wrapping around his own. It felt like waking up in a house that wasn't empty anymore. And that terrified him. Because Damien Cross didn't have weaknesses. And now, he had two. No. Three. His jaw tightened as he watched Lena from across the living room, where she sat curled on the couch with Emma in her arms, humming softly as the baby drifted to sleep. The way she looked with their daughter, the softness, the warmth, it made something dangerously possessive coil inside him. She was his. Even if she didn't realize it yet. That afternoon, Damien found Noah in the study, struggling to tie his own shoelaces. Lena had just gone upstairs to put Emma down for a nap, and the little boy sat on the floor, his small brows furrowed in frustration. Damien rolled closer, watching silently. After a few minutes, Noah let out a huff. "I can't do it." Damien arched a brow. "Can't?" Noah sighed. "It's hard." Damien's lips twitched. "That's not an excuse." Noah looked up, blinking. Damien exhaled, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt before gesturing for Noah to come closer. "Watch carefully," he murmured, taking the laces between his fingers, demonstrating slowly. "You cross them, pull one loop, then tuck the other through." Noah watched intently. Damien repeated the motion, this time guiding Noah's small hands to follow. After 2 tries, Noah finally got it. The boy's face lit up. "I did it!" A strange warmth spread through Damien's chest. It was a small thing, insignificant even. But to Noah, it was everything. For the first time, Damien understood what it meant to teach, to guide, to be a father, and it shook him to his core. Later that evening, as the sun set over the estate, Damien was in his office when his phone buzzed. His head of security. "Sir, we have a problem." Damien's grip tightened on the phone. "Explain." "There's been an intrusion." His body went ice cold. "Intrusion?" His voice was deadly. The man hesitated. "It's Miss Hale, sir." Damien's blood boiled. "Victoria." He should have known she wouldn't go down quietly. "I'll handle it," he snapped, ending the call. His jaw clenched as he wheeled out of his office, heading straight for the living room, where Lena was. Where his children were. No one would take them from him. Not Victoria. Not anyone. The moment Damien reached the foyer, Victoria was already there, smirking. Lena stood a few feet away, tense, protective. And Victoria? She looked far too pleased. "Well," she mused, glancing around the grand hall. "You certainly play the part of a devoted father well, Damien." His expression darkened. "Get out." Victoria's smile didn't falter. Instead, she pulled a folder from her designer purse and held it up. Legal documents. Lena's breath hitched beside him. Damien's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "What are you doing, Victoria?" She sighed dramatically. "Oh, Damien, I just thought you should know. If you're planning to play house, you might want to check your legal standing." She let that hang in the air before smirking. "You see, technically, you and I are still engaged." Silence. Lena's heart stopped. Damien's expression turned murderous. Lena's breaking point. Lena had had enough. Of Damien's past creeping in, of Victoria acting like she had any control over their lives, of feeling like an outsider in her own family. She stepped forward, eyes blazing. "I don't care what you think you have over him," she said, voice sharp. "But Damien is not yours." Victoria laughed. "Oh, darling," she purred. "You really think you've won?" Lena's hands fisted at her sides. Before she could respond, Damien moved. With slow, calculated control, he wheeled closer, his expression cold as ice. And then he reached for Lena, pulled her close, right onto his lap. Lena gasped, stiffening. But Damien? He smirked. And then, right in front of Victoria, the woman who thought she still had a hold over him, he kissed Lena. Deep, slow, possessive. Lena's breath hitched. When he pulled away, his lips were still ghosting over hers. And his voice? A deadly promise. "She's mine, Victoria, and nothing you do will ever change that." Victoria's smirk vanished. And Lena? She couldn't breathe, because whether it was for show or not, that kiss had felt too real, and she had no idea what to do about it. Chapter 12, A Line Crossed. The moment Victoria stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Lena shoved herself off Damien's lap. Her chest heaved, her breath uneven as she stared at him in disbelief. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. Damien tilted his head, watching her with amusement. "It was necessary." "Necessary?" she hissed. "You kissed me in front of her like I was yours to prove a point." He leaned back slightly, completely unbothered. "You are mine." Her blood boiled. "No," she snapped. am here for my children. That does not mean you get to. Damien's eyes darkened. I get to do whatever I want, Lena. She stiffened, because there was something in his tone, something dangerous that sent a shiver down her spine. And what scared her most? The way her body responded to it. For the rest of the evening, Lena avoided him. She kept herself busy, feeding Emma, playing with Noah, pacing in her room until her legs ached. But no matter what she did, she couldn't escape it. The feel of his lips on hers, the way his fingers had gripped her waist, possessive and firm, the heat that had ignited in her veins, the way she had melted before she could stop herself. And worst of all, the fact that Damien knew it, knew exactly what he was doing, knew exactly how he was breaking her defenses. That night, when the house was silent, Lena finally left her room. She needed air, space, distance from him. But as she made her way downstairs, she stopped short, because Damien was already there, in the dimly lit living room, sitting by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, as if he had been waiting for her. Her heart slammed against her ribs. He glanced up, his blue eyes shadowed, unreadable. Couldn't sleep? He murmured. She crossed her arms, her pulse wild. You know damn well why. His smirk was slow, lazy, arrogant. Still thinking about the kiss? Her fingers curled into fists. You used me, she accused. His eyes darkened. I told you. It was necessary. She hated how calm he was, how in control, but she refused to let him win. Don't ever do that again, she warned. I'm not some piece on your chessboard, Damien. He studied her for a long, slow moment. Then he moved, pushed his chair forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. She backed up, but he caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm. A warning, a claim. You think you're not a piece on my chessboard? He murmured, his voice low, velvety, lethal. Her breath hitched. His fingers traced up her arm, sending a shiver through her. You're not just a piece, Lena, he continued, his voice a dark promise. You're the queen. Her heart stopped, because she wasn't sure if it was a threat or a confession, and that terrified her more than anything. The next morning, everything unraveled. It started with Noah running into Damien's office, his little face pale. Dad, he gasped. There was a lady outside watching us. Lena's blood ran cold. Damien's expression turned to steel. He was already grabbing his phone, barking orders to security. Find her. No hesitation, no doubt, just pure, raw authority. Noah looked nervous, but Damien reached out, cupping his son's small face. You're safe, he said, his voice calm but firm. No one will touch you, ever. Lena watched it happen, watched Noah cling to his father's presence. Watched Damien become something terrifying and protective all at once. And she realized something. Damien wasn't just fighting for power anymore. He was fighting for them, for their children, for her. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Later that night, when the house was secure and the threat had been handled, Lena found Damien alone in his study. She was done running. She stormed inside, slamming the door behind her. You can't just decide everything for us. He barely looked up. I can, and I will. Her anger boiled over. I don't belong to you, Damien. At that, he finally moved, wheeled toward her, grabbed her wrist, pulling her onto his lap like it was effortless. Déjà vu, but this time she didn't push him away, didn't stop him when his fingers trailed over her skin, when his voice dropped to a whisper. Say it again. She swallowed hard. I don't belong to you. His lips grazed her ear. Liar. A shiver rocked through her. She should fight him. She should leave. But instead, she was leaning in, her hands gripping his shirt, her lips a breath away from his. You're playing a dangerous game, she whispered. His smirk was pure sin. I never lose, Lena. And then his mouth crashed onto hers, and this time she didn't stop him. Chapter 13, Bound by Fire and Blood. Lena didn't sleep that night. Her body was still burning from the kiss. Damien had kissed her before, but this was different. This wasn't about proving a point. This wasn't about winning. This was raw, demanding, consuming, and worse, she had kissed him back. She had wanted more. The realization shook her to her core. Because Damien Cross was dangerous, not just because of his power, but because he made her want to surrender. And that was terrifying. By morning, Lena had barely pulled herself together. She found Damien in Emma's nursery, sitting beside her crib. It had become a habit now, him checking on her, staying by her side as she slept. But this time, Emma was awake, and she was staring up at him, wide-eyed. Lena froze in the doorway, because for the first time Emma reached for him. A small, wobbly hand stretching toward her father. Damien's entire body stilled. Then, Slowly, as if afraid of breaking her, he reached out, letting her tiny fingers wrap around his. Lena's throat tightened. Damien had held empires. He had crushed men. But right now, he looked like a man who had just been undone by the smallest touch in the world. Emma cooed softly, her tiny fingers gripping onto his. Damien exhaled slowly, his other hand coming up to brush a thumb over her soft cheek. "You're stronger than they think, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. Emma giggled. "And Damien?" He smiled. Not a smirk, not his usual arrogance, a real soft smile. Lena felt her heart crack, because she knew this man would burn the world for this little girl, and maybe, just maybe, he would do the same for all of them. Breakfast was tense. Noah chattered happily as he ate, oblivious to the storm brewing between his parents. Lena could barely look at Damien, because every time she did, she remembered the way his lips had felt against hers. The way his hands had held her like he wasn't going to let her go. The way she had melted into him. She forced herself to eat, trying to ignore the way Damien watched her. Like he was waiting. Like he knew she was thinking about it, too. She hated that he was right. Halfway through breakfast, Damien's phone buzzed. His expression darkened immediately. Lena's stomach dropped. He stood abruptly, his voice sharp. Watched the twins, and then he was gone. Lena exchanged a glance with Noah. "Stay here, sweetheart," she said softly, before following Damien down the hall. She found him in his office, speaking in a dangerously low tone. "She tried again?" he growled. A pause. His entire body went rigid. Lena stepped closer, her pulse hammering. "What's happening?" Damien exhaled sharply, ending the call. Then he turned to her. "Victoria hired a private investigator." Lena's blood ran cold. "She's looking for something to use against us." Damien's jaw clenched. "She won't find anything, because I won't give her the chance." His blue eyes locked onto hers. "I told you before, Lena, you and the twins are mine." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And I don't share what's mine." A shiver ran down her spine. Because this wasn't just a warning. This was a promise. That night, the storm between them finally exploded. Lena found Damien in the library, his face unreadable as he stared into the fire. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer. "Why did you kiss me?" Damien slowly turned his chair to face her. "You already know why." Her fists clenched. "You don't own me." His smirk was slow, dangerous. "Then why do you act like you do?" Her breath hitched, because she knew what he meant. The way she reacted to him. The way she leaned into his touch instead of pulling away. He saw it all. He felt it. And now he was calling her out on it. She stepped forward, eyes blazing. "I'm not afraid of you." His gaze darkened. "You should be," she stilled. Because his voice, low, rough, raw, wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. A warning that if she let him, he would ruin her. And worse, she wasn't sure she would stop him. Damien's eyes flickered to her lips. Lena saw it happen. The moment his control slipped. The moment the fire burned too hot. She should have moved. Should have stopped this before it could start. But then, his fingers grazed her wrist. And she felt it. The pull. The undeniable heat. Lena's breath hitched as he leaned in. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me to stop." She should have, but she didn't. She couldn't. Because somewhere along the way she had stopped wanting to fight him. And that was more dangerous than anything. Chapter 14, A Game of Fire. Lena had spent 3 years building walls between herself and Damien Cross. But last night, he had shattered them. She had let him touch her, let him close the distance, let herself feel the heat between them. And she hadn't stopped him. Now, as the sun rose over the estate, Lena was drowning in the aftermath. Because no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she wanted him. And that was a problem. At breakfast, she avoided his gaze. She focused on cutting Noah's pancakes into tiny pieces, on adjusting Emma's blanket, on anything but the man sitting across from her. But Damien, he didn't look away. His blue eyes burned into her, as if he knew exactly what was racing through her mind, like he was waiting for her to break. And that made her even angrier. She shoved her chair back, muttering, "I'm taking Emma outside." Before Damien could respond, she was gone. Because she needed distance. She needed to breathe. But Damien Cross, he wasn't going to let her escape. Lena was in the garden, rocking Emma gently in her arms when she felt his presence behind her. He didn't say anything, didn't move, but she could feel it. The weight of his gaze, his control. "Damien," she sighed, not turning around. "What do you want?" His voice was smooth, dangerous. "You know exactly what I want, Lena." She closed her eyes. Because she did know. And that was the problem. He moved closer, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You ran last night." Lena's breath hitched. "I didn't run," he chuckled, dark and low. "You always run." She turned sharply, glaring up at him. "And maybe you should let me." His smirk faded. And then he caged her in, one hand on the railing beside her, his chair rolling just close enough to trap her. "You really think I'll let you go, Lena?" he murmured. "After everything?" Her chest rose and fell too fast. His eyes dropped to her lips, and for a second, just a second, she wanted to let him win. But then, the gates outside the estate slammed open. Lena jumped back. Damien's entire body tensed, because standing at the entrance, flanked by 2 security guards, was Victoria. And this time, she wasn't alone. She was holding a legal document in her hands. Lena stiffened, Damien's jaw clenched. Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. Well, she purred, striding forward, heels clicking against the stone. "Aren't we cozy?" Lena's stomach twisted. Damien's voice was ice. "Get out, Victoria." She ignored him. Instead, she held up the papers in her hands. "You might want to read this first." Damien didn't move, didn't react, but Lena saw it, the slight tension in his jaw. Victoria's smile deepened. "This," she continued, tossing the papers onto the table beside them, "is a petition for custody." Lena froze. "Custody?" Her breath caught. "You can't be serious." Victoria's eyes gleamed. "Oh, but I am." She turned her gaze to Damien, watching him carefully. "You think you've won, don't you?" she whispered. "But you forget, Damien. I know your secrets." Damien's expression didn't change, but Lena could feel the shift in him. Victoria smiled, leaning in closer. "I wonder," she mused, trailing a finger down the armrest of his chair, "what would happen if the court knew how reckless you've been, how unstable, how unfit to raise 2 children?" Lena's blood ran cold, because she knew exactly what Victoria was trying to do. She wasn't just trying to hurt Damien. She was trying to take their children away. And that was a war Damien Cross wouldn't lose. Damien leaned back slightly, tilting his head. Then slowly, so slowly, he smirked. And Victoria, she faltered, because she realized too late that she had made a mistake, a huge mistake. Damien's voice was smooth as silk, sharp as a blade. "You always overplay your hand, Victoria." She stiffened, and then Damien moved. In one swift motion, he grabbed the papers from the table, crumpling them in his fist. And then he threw them into the fire beside him. Victoria gasped. You don't exist to me anymore." His voice was low, lethal. "You will not touch my children. You will not speak their names. You will not breathe the same air as them." His smirk faded into something darker. "You have no power here, Victoria," and she knew it, because this wasn't a battle she could win. Not against Damien, not against the man who had already taken back everything she had tried to steal. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. But she wasn't done. Not yet. "We'll see about that," she whispered. Then she turned on her heel and left. The moment Victoria was gone, Lena let out a shaky breath. "She's not going to stop," she whispered. Damien rolled closer, his voice calm, controlled. "She already lost." Lena frowned. "How can you be so sure?" he smirked. "Because I don't lose, Lena." And somehow she believed him. She wanted to believe him. But that didn't explain the way her pulse quickened when he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're mine," he murmured. His fingers brushed her wrist. His lips ghosted over her ear. And Lena, she didn't pull away, because deep down, she knew she had already lost the game. Chapter 16, A Future Sealed in Fire. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Lena had ever known. Gone were the days of running, of fearing what would come next. Because now, she was his. And Damien Cross, he made sure the entire world knew it. Lena sat by the window, watching as Noah ran across the garden, Damien following close behind in his wheelchair, coaching him through self-defense drills. It was a sight that once would have seemed impossible. Damien, the ruthless billionaire, the man who had once believed he would never be a father, had become one in every sense of the word. Lena felt a warmth in her chest as Noah grinned up at him, his little face beaming with pride. "You're getting faster," Damien murmured, adjusting Noah's stance. "But you need to think before you move." Noah nodded, hanging on to every word. Lena had spent years wondering if this moment would ever come. If Damien would truly love their children. If he would be the father they deserved. Now she had her answer. He already was. Later that evening, Lena found Damien in Emma's nursery. He was rocking her gently, his strong arms holding her with a tenderness that still stunned her. Lena leaned against the doorway, watching them. "You've changed," she murmured. Damien looked up, smirking slightly. "Have I?" She stepped closer. "You're softer with them." His blue eyes darkened. "Not soft." Lena raised a brow. "No?" His gaze flickered to Emma, who cooed softly in his arms. His jaw clenched slightly. "I would kill for them, Lena." His voice was low, dangerous. "I would burn this world to the ground before I let anyone take them from me." Lena's breath hitched, because she believed him. He had already proven it, and now she knew he would never stop protecting them. Ever. That night, as the twins slept, Damien pulled Lena onto the balcony. The moonlight bathed them in silver, his strong arms wrapping around her waist. She leaned into him, letting herself feel it, the safety, the certainty, the love. Damien's lips brushed against her ear. "You're not running anymore." It wasn't a question, it was a truth. Lena exhaled, turning in his arms. "No," she looked up at him. "I'm not." His smirk was slow, dark, victorious. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "You're mine, Lena." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Now. Always." She shivered, not in fear, but in surrender, because she was his, and Damien, he was hers too. Epilogue. Forever his 5 years later. The Cross estate was no longer silent. It was filled with laughter, tiny footsteps, and the warmth of a family Damien once believed he would never have. The ruthless billionaire, the man who had once thought he could never have children, never love, was now surrounded by chaos and joy, and he wouldn't have it any other way. "Dad! Dad! You're gonna miss it!" Damien smirked as Noah barreled into his office, his 7-year-old face flushed with excitement. Lena stood in the doorway, Emma on her hip, shaking her head with a small smile. "You promised you'd help him train today," Lena teased. Damien set his pen down, rolling toward them. "And I never break a promise." Emma giggled, reaching for him. Damien took her in his arms effortlessly, his large hands dwarfing her tiny frame. "You," he murmured, brushing a kiss against her forehead, "are getting heavier." Emma giggled. "I'm growing up, Daddy." Damien felt something tighten in his chest, because he had watched them grow. He had been there for every milestone, every birthday, every late-night fever. He hadn't missed a thing. And that was worth more than any empire. Later that evening, after the twins were asleep, Damien found Lena on the balcony, gazing out over the ocean. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "You're thinking again," he murmured against her skin. She smiled softly. "I was thinking about how different things are now." His grip tightened. "Better." She turned in his arms, cupping his face. "Yes," she whispered. "Better." She let out a slow breath. "Damien, I have something to tell you." He raised a brow, curious. She took his hand and guided it to her stomach. Damien froze, his blue eyes snapped to hers, wide, searching. "Lena," his voice was hoarse, disbelieving. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm pregnant." A sharp breath left him. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he crushed her against him, burying his face in her neck. Lena laughed softly, holding on to him. "You're happy?" she whispered. He pulled back, cupping her face, his eyes burning with emotion. "You have no idea." Damien Cross had spent his life building an empire, but his greatest empire wasn't his company. It was his family, his wife, his children, his legacy. And as he held Lena close, knowing their future was growing inside her, he made one final vow. That no matter what came next, no matter what storm threatened them, he would protect them, always. Because they were his. And Damien Cross never let go of what was his. The end. Written by Maria. Thank you all for taking the time to dive into this story with me. I truly appreciate your support and love hearing your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey filled with passion, drama, and unexpected twists, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. There's so much more to come, and I can't wait to share it all with you. Stay tuned for more incredible stories, and as always, thank you for being part of this amazing journey. See you in the next one.